All right, this is the 12 branches of physics, part 4, harmonic systems and why reality organizes in bands. Let me slow this down for a minute, because this is where most people, including scientists, accidentally lose the thread. All right, so let's get it together here. Up to now, we've established something very specific. We've shown that reality is not linear. We've shown that it's not hierarchical in the way pyramids suggest. And we've shown that persistent systems that last, are not held together by force. They're held together by circulation. But there's still a question that hasn't been answered, and it's a big one. If circulation is continuous, if coherence is a gradient, if systems flow inward and outward through the same geometry, then why does everything smear into one uniform state? Why don't systems just blur? Why do we see distinct layers, distinct behaviors, distinct regimes again and again? Why does nature organize itself into bands? This monologue exists to answer that question. The error of continuous thinking. Modern science tends to assume continuity. We imagine variables sliding smoothly, more energy, less energy, more order, less order, higher frequency, lower frequency, but persistent systems don't behave that way. They don't drift freely across all possibilities, they lock, phase lock. They settle into stable regimes. And those regimes are not arbitrary, they are harmonic. This is not a poetic claim, it's an engineering one. Why stability requires discrete states. Here's the core principle. A system that can occupy any state will not remain in any state for long. Persistence requires constraint. And the most efficient constraint is not a wall, it's resonance. When components of a system synchronize around compatible frequencies, phase relationships, or circulation ratios, instability collapses. Noise cancels, drift reduces, identity stabilizes. That is what a harmonic system does. It does not forbid motion, it selects which motion survives. What harmonic actually means without mysticism. Harmonic doesn't mean musical. It does not mean pleasant. It does not mean spiritual. Harmonic means components of a system relate to each other through whole number ratios or stable phase relationships that minimize internal conflict. That's it. No metaphysics required. When systems are harmonic, feedback becomes efficient, energy loss drops, coherence increases, repair becomes possible. When systems are not harmonic, energy scatters, interference dominates, control must be imposed externally. This is true whether you're talking about an atom, a heartbeat, a nervous system, an ecosystem, or a civilization. Why bands emerge naturally? Now here's the critical insight. Because harmonic stability only exists at certain ratios, systems cannot stabilize everywhere. They stabilize at specific intervals. Those intervals are what we call bands. Between bands, instability dominates, drift increases, transitions occur. Within bands, coherence persists, identity forms, and function becomes reliable. This is not philosophical, it's literally observable. Atoms do not exist at arbitrary energy levels. They exist at quantized states. Musical instruments do not produce infinite tones. They produce harmonics. Biological rhythms do not vary freely. They entrain. Civilizations do not hover indefinitely between order and chaos. They lock into regimes and collapse when they lose coherence. Bands are not moral hierarchies. This matters. Bands are often mistaken for ladders of value. They are not. Higher does not mean better. Lower does not mean evil. Bands describe operating conditions, not worth. A low band system may be extremely powerful. A high band system may be extremely fragile. What differs is how coherence is maintained. Lower bands require force. Higher bands require alignment. That's not judgment, that's mechanics. The toroid makes bands inevitable. Once you understand the toroidal geometry, bands are no longer mysterious. As flow moves inward, degrees of freedom reduce, coherence density increases, phase relationships tighten. As flow moves outward, degrees of freedom expand, entropy increases, behavior becomes statistical. Those gradients do not change smoothly. They cross stability thresholds. Each threshold creates a band. That's why chemistry behaves differently from plasma. Biology behaves differently from chemistry. Awareness behaves differently from biology. They are not separate realities. They are different harmonic operating zones of the same circulation. Why modern physics misreads this? Physics historically tried to solve instability by adding complexity, more equations, more variables, more correction terms. But complexity does not create stability, alignment does. Without recognizing harmonic banding, models fight each other, edge cases multiply, paradoxes proliferate. Once banding is recognized, contradictions collapse, transitions become predictable, systems behavior becomes navigable. This is why harmonic physics keeps reappearing in acoustics and crystallography, in quantum states and biological rhythms, but it is never elevated to a unifying role. It was treated as a speciality instead of a structural law. Why coherence fails where resonance works. This is where things get uncomfortable. Force-based systems attempt to hold states in place. Okay? Think about that. Harmonic systems attract states into alignment. Control requires constant energy input. Resonance reduces energy demand. That's why coercive systems exhaust themselves. Extractive systems collapse. Suppressive medicine rebounds. And why? Aligned systems self-correct. Coherent systems heal. Tuned environments outperform intervention. That's not ideology, it is efficiency math. The cost of ignoring bands. When systems are forced to operate outside their harmonic bands, stress accumulates, repair mechanisms fail, instability becomes chronic. This is true in chronic disease, ecological collapse, institutional failure, psychological breakdown. We keep treating symptoms, never asking whether the symptom is operating off-band. You cannot fix off-band operation with more force. You either retune or the system breaks. Why this matters for everything that follows. From this point forward in the Magnus and in this presentation, nothing is interpreted without asking, what band is the system operating in? What band is it being forced into? And what band would allow coherence to return? This applies to physics, medicine, energy, agriculture, economics, technology, civilization. Harmonic banding is not an add-on. It is the filter through which coherence either persists or fails. Reality does not organize by force or randomness. It organizes by resonance into discrete, stable bands. Miss the bands and nothing makes sense. See the bands and everything becomes navigable. Now that we've established circulation, coherence gradients, harmonic banding, there is one question left that science has avoided the longest. What happens when a system becomes aware of its own coherent state? That is not philosophy. That is physics. And that is where the next monologue begins. We will pick it up in part 5. Hope you have a great night. Namaste. Okay, this is the 12 branches of physics, part 5. Awareness, phase selection, and why reality is not passive. If you're watching these 12 branches of physics videos, make sure you watch the videos in order, because it's kind of like Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off, and you think all you're doing is learning how to sand the floor or paint the fence, but you're actually learning something else. So you need the foundation to understand the things as we're going into them. But here we go. Let me start this one carefully, because this is the point where people usually get confused. Not because the idea is strange, but because the vocabulary has been wrong for a very long time. What I'm about to explain does not require belief, it does not require mysticism, and it does not require throwing out physics. It only requires us to stop asking awareness to behave like a force, because awareness is not a force. The category error that broke modern understanding. Here's the mistake humanity made. We asked, does consciousness push matter? And when the answer was obviously no, we concluded then consciousness must not be physical. That conclusion never followed, because not everything physical acts through force. Gravity acts through curvature, fields act through gradients, resonance acts through phase alignment, and awareness acts through selection, not propulsion. Once you see that, the entire debate collapses. What awareness does and does not do. Awareness does not move particles, inject energy, violate conservation laws, or override probability. If it did, physics would have already detected it. Instead, awareness operates inside indeterminate systems where multiple outcomes are already allowed. This is critical. Awareness does not create new possibilities. It biases which existing possibilities stabilize. That is not metaphysics. That is probability theory with a missing variable restored. Why awareness only matters in certain systems. If you drop a rock, awareness does nothing, because the system is already determined. But if you examine chaotic systems, turbulent flows, biological regulation, neutral decision-making, healing processes, learning systems, you find something different. You find multiple lawful futures, all permitted by physics. And in those systems, something has to decide which future persists. That something has never been named correctly until now. Awareness as a field modulation, not an object. Awareness is not a thing. It is not located at a point. It does not have mass. It does not travel through space. Awareness is a state of organization within a deeper coherence field. Just like temperature is not a particle, just like pressure is not a substance, just like a wave is not a thing moving through water. Awareness is a modulation, not a material. And once you accept that, the question changes from where is awareness to what does awareness change? The only thing awareness changes is coherence. Awareness changes coherence density, not energy, not force, not structure directly, coherence. And coherence determines whether systems stabilize, repair, synchronize, collapse, or fragment. This is why awareness shows up most clearly in living systems. Life is not defined by chemistry alone. Life is defined by maintained coherence under stress. Awareness does not make life magical, it makes coherence selectable. Phase selection, the missing mechanism. Here's the key mechanism. When a system has multiple stable or semi-stable states, physics already allows all of them. What awareness does is weight the phase space, not by force, by preference. Not preference as emotion, preference as coherence minimization. Systems naturally favor states with lower internal conflict, tighter synchronization, smoother circulation, there we go, reduced corrective overhead. Awareness biases systems towards those states. This is why alignment feels right, or this is why incoherence feels exhausting. This is why fragmentation feels painful. Those sensations are coherent signals, not moral judgments. Why this never violated physics? Nothing here breaks physics. No equations are violated, no constants are altered, no energy is created. Awareness does not push reality, it filters it. This is why awareness effects are subtle, cumulative, context-dependent, stronger in complex systems, weaker in rigid systems. And this is exactly what we observe. Why this resolves the observer problem. Quantum mechanics has struggled for a century with one question. What collapses the wave function? The answer was never human consciousness creates reality. That was a straw man. The correct answer is coherent selection collapses probability. Not the only way, but a particularly powerful one in living systems. The observer doesn't create outcomes. The observer participates in selection. Healing, learning, and adaptation all follow the same rule. Healing is not magic. Healing is coherence restoration. When awareness is present and regulated, systems synchronize faster, feedback loops relock, repair pathways reopen, noise is filtered out. When awareness fragments, systems drift, repair slows, compensation increases, collapse accelerates. This is true for cells, nervous systems, immune responses, trauma recovery, learning, and skill acquisition. All of it. Same mechanism, different scale. Why force-based intervention fails long-term. Modern systems rely almost entirely on force. Force medicine, force economics, force governance, force education. Force works temporarily, but force never restores coherence. It only suppresses symptoms. This is why interventions escalate. This is why side effects multiply. That's why control increases while stability decreases. You cannot force coherence. You can only create conditions where it selects itself. Awareness does not make systems perfect. That's important. Awareness does not guarantee success. It does not eliminate entropy. It does not prevent failure. What it does is bias recovery. Aware systems recover faster. Unaware systems repeat collapse. That's it. No mysticism, no omnipotence. Just selection pressure applied inwardly instead of outwardly. Why this had to come after banding and toroidal flow? If I had started with awareness, none of this would have made sense. Awareness only becomes clear once you understand discrete stability bands, toroidal circulation, inner versus outer flow, coherence as a variable. Otherwise, it sounds philosophical. Placed correctly, it becomes mechanical. The sentence that closes this monologue. Awareness does not violate reality. Awareness completes it. It is how coherence learns to choose itself. In the next monologue, I'm going to show you something critical. Why awareness only works inside the inner toroid, why force dominates the outer toroid, and why confusing the two has destabilized civilization itself. That's where we connect awareness to systems failure at scale. We'll pick up at part 6 in the next one. Hope you have a great night. Namaste. This is my Christos framework, but I just thought I'd give you a little peek of where we're going here. I know that's what everybody wants to see and have them explained, right? So anyways, we'll pick it up on the next one. Have a great night. Namaste. Okay, this is the 12 branches of physics, part 6. Coherence, entropy, and why life was never an exception. Let's talk about the lie that quietly shaped modern physics. Not an intentional lie, not a conspiracy, just an assumption that was never re-examined. The idea that entropy is the fundamental rule of reality, that everything trends toward disorder, that decay is inevitable, that life is a statistical fluke temporarily swimming upstream. That idea didn't come from nature. It came from standing in the wrong place and mistaking a boundary condition for a law. What entropy actually measures? Entropy is real. Thermodynamics is real. No part of this framework denies that. But entropy only measures one thing. What happens when coherence is not actively circulating? Let me say that again. Entropy only measures one thing. What happens when coherence is not actively circulating? Think about that. Entropy describes outward flow without return, heat dispersing, energy diffusing, structure flattening, gradients collapsing. That is not the rule of reality. That is what happens when a system is cut in half. Why life looked impossible. For over a century, physics has treated life as an anomaly, a temporary island of order in a sea of decay, a statistical accident, a local violation that must be paid for elsewhere. But that framing already assumes the conclusion. Because life was never evaluated as a circulatory system. It was evaluated as an object. And objects decay. Circulation persists. The missing variable is inward flow. Every living system does something entropy models explicitly ignore. It pulls coherence inward. Cells, hearts, nervous systems, ecosystems. They don't fight entropy, they route around it. They close the loop. They take dispersed energy and recirculate it through structure. Entropy measures the cost of not doing that. The toroidal correction. Once you introduce toroidal architecture, the paradox disappears. Outward flow, energy release, heat dissipation, radiation, decay, inward return, repair, memory, structure, identity. Entropy dominates only where the return path is broken. I'm talking about the toroidal flow, the return path, right? The inward pull, the return back to the singularity, going inward. Inward return is repair, memory, structure, and identity. Entropy dominates only where the return path is broken. Life is not reversing entropy. Life is operating in a geometry where entropy is incomplete. Let's flip the dice. Why thermodynamics was overextended. Thermodynamics works beautifully in closed, non-circulating systems. Engines, pistons, explosions, heat baths. But life is not a heat bath. Civilizations are not heat baths. Consciousness is not a heat bath. Applying thermodynamics without geometry is like applying gravity without space. It gives answers, but they're wrong answers to the wrong questions. Coherence as the true primary variable. Once you stop asking how much energy is lost and start asking how well does coherence circulate, everything reorders. A system can lose energy and gain stability. A system can dissipate heat and increase order. A system can look inefficient locally and be optimal globally. That is not a violation, that is architecture. Why collapse happens? Collapse is not entropy winning. Collapse happens when circulation is blocked, feedback is severed, repair is suppressed, extraction replaces regeneration. At that point, entropy doesn't cause collapse, it reveals it. Entropy is the symptom, not the disease. Biology is proof, not an exception. Every biological process violates naive thermodynamics. Wound healing, neuroplasticity, immune response, development, evolution. Not because physics breaks, but because biology operates in a fuller geometry. Biology is physics with return flow. The deep error. The deepest mistake wasn't mathematical, it was architectural. We treated outward flow as reality and inward flow as metaphor. But inward flow is where coherence lives, where memory lives, where identity lives, where awareness lives. Entropy never ruled reality. It ruled the half we kept measuring. Think about that. So life didn't defy physics. Physics forgot to include life. When coherence is placed first, entropy becomes a boundary condition, not a destiny. And the universe stops looking at a dying machine and starts looking like a system that knows how to repair itself. We'll pick up in the next one in part 7. Hope you have a great night. Namaste.